Before we dive in, pause for a moment and tell me something. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Maybe it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France. Don't just watch quietly. Drop a comment below and let's see how far this story reaches across the world. Now, lean in and let's begin. The autumn wind cut through the Montana Valley like a blade of ice, rattling the windows of the small ranch house where Lucien Beaumont sat staring at a letter that had arrived on the morning stage. His calloused hands trembled as he read the elegant script for the third time. Each word both a promise and a terror that made his chest tight with emotions he'd buried years ago. Dear Mr. Beaumont, I am writing in response to your advertisement for a wife. My name is Evangeline Moreau, and I believe we might find in each other what we have both been seeking. The letter smelled faintly of lavender, a scent so foreign in his world of cattle and dust that it might as well have been magic. Outside, his dog Rex whined at the door, sensing his master's agitation through the bond that came from years of shared solitude. The ranch stretched for miles in every direction. A kingdom of grass and sky that Lucien had built with his own hands after the war took everything else from him. Neighbors were distant specks on the horizon, and conversation was something that happened when he rode to town for supplies once a month. The silence that had once been his refuge now felt like a weight crushing down on his chest, each empty room in the house echoing with the ghosts of dreams he'd abandoned. He'd placed the advertisement in a moment of whiskey-soaked desperation 3 months ago, after finding himself talking to the cattle like they were old friends and setting 2 places at the dinner table out of habit. The responses had been few. Rough women seeking escape from Eastern factories, widows with children looking for security, girls too young to understand what frontier life demanded. But Evangeline's letter was different. Her words carried education and grace, speaking of a desire for authentic connection with a man of substance and character, in language that suggested she'd read books he'd never heard of. The photograph tucked inside the envelope showed a woman of perhaps 25 with dark hair swept back in the latest fashion and eyes that seemed to hold secrets even through the sepia tones. She was beautiful in a way that made Lucien question why such a woman would need to travel west for a husband, why she would choose isolation and hardship over the comfort that her obvious refinement could have secured in any Eastern city. Something about her expression, a mixture of sadness and determination, reminded him of his own reflection in the mirror after particularly difficult days. At the bottom of the letter she'd written, I will arrive on the November 15th stage if your response is favorable. I ask only that you judge me by my actions rather than my past, as I promise to do the same for you. The date was 2 weeks away. Barely enough time to prepare the house for a woman's presence or his heart for the possibility that loneliness might finally have an end. As thunder rolled across the prairie and the first drops of rain began to fall, Lucien reached for his pen with the terrifying realization that he was about to change his life forever. 3 years earlier, Lucien had arrived in Montana territory with nothing but a horse, a rifle, and scars both visible and hidden from the battlefields of Gettysburg and Antietam. The homestead land had cost him every dollar he'd saved during 4 years of war. But it represented something more valuable than money, a chance to build something clean and permanent in a world that seemed determined to tear everything down. The first winter had nearly killed him, with blizzards that lasted for days and cold that made his bones ache with memories of campfires shared with men who would never see home again. But Lucien had survived through the kind of stubborn determination that had carried him through war, building his ranch one fence post at a time while learning that cattle were more predictable than people and that the land rewarded hard work without asking questions about the nightmares that woke him screaming in the dark. His neighbors, scattered though they were, came to respect the quiet man who could deliver a breached calf or mend a broken windmill with equal skill. though none had ever been invited past his front porch for the kind of conversation that might have revealed the pain he carried. The advertisement had been written during a February blizzard that trapped him in the house for 6 days, with only Rex for company, and too much time to think about the silence that filled every corner of his life. He'd started it as a joke, a way to pass time while the wind howled outside. But as the words took shape on paper, he realized he was writing his heart's deepest confession. Rancher 32 seeks wife for companionship and partnership in frontier life. Must be strong, practical, and willing to build something lasting in beautiful but challenging territory. Refinement welcomed, pretense discouraged. The responses had trickled in over the following months, each one forcing him to confront the reality that advertising for a wife was easier than actually choosing one. Martha Collins from Ohio wrote with the desperation of someone fleeing debt and scandal. Sarah Mitchell from Pennsylvania included a list of demands that made marriage sound like a business contract negotiated by lawyers. Young Jenny Thompson from New York spoke of adventure and romance with the naivety of someone who thought frontier life resembled the novels she'd read. But Evangeline's letter had arrived on a morning when the cottonwoods along the creek were turning gold and the air carried the promise of winter, her words striking him like lightning in clear sky. She wrote of loneliness as something to be shared rather than endured, of building a partnership that honored both independence and connection. Her photograph showed intelligence in her eyes and strength in the set of her shoulders, while her script suggested education without arrogance. For the first time since arriving in Montana, Lucien allowed himself to imagine that the empty spaces in his life might be filled by something other than work and whiskey. The 2 weeks between receiving Evangeline's letter and her scheduled arrival passed like a fever dream of preparation and second-guessing. Lucien found himself seeing his ranch through a woman's eyes, noticing for the first time how the kitchen lacked curtains, how the spare bedroom held nothing but dust and broken furniture, how his own habits had grown rough around the edges from too many years of having no one to impress or disappoint. He rode to town 3 times in those 2 weeks, a frequency that made the shopkeeper comment with raised eyebrows and barely concealed amusement. At Morrison's general store, he stood paralyzed before bolts of fabric that might become curtains, while Mrs. Morrison offered advice about what a refined lady might expect in a frontier home. "You'll want something cheerful," she said, unrolling yellow cotton decorated with tiny flowers. "Eastern women are used to more color than we see out here, more softness in their surroundings, and you'll need proper dishes, not those tin plates you've been using." A woman notices things like that. Her words carried the authority of someone who had successfully maintained civilization in a place where it had to be imported by the yard. The mirror in his bedroom revealed a man who looked older than his 32 years, with lines around his eyes from squinting into prairie sun and a beard that had grown wild from neglect. He trimmed it carefully, remembering his mother's lessons about presenting himself as a gentleman even in rough circumstances. His best shirt, stored in a trunk since his arrival, smelled of lavender sachets his sister had packed years ago, a connection to the world he'd left behind that now seemed both precious and painful. The house itself required attention that went beyond simple cleaning. Lucien repaired the loose board in the front porch, replaced the cracked glass in the kitchen window, and even hung the curtains that Mrs. Morrison had helped him select. Each improvement felt like a prayer that Evangeline would find his home worthy of her presence, while simultaneously reminding him how much of his life had been built for solitude rather than partnership. The spare bedroom, hastily converted into a proper ladies' room with a new bed and washstand, felt like a shrine to possibilities he hardly dared contemplate. As November 15th approached, Lucien found himself alternately hoping the stage would be delayed and checking his pocket watch every few minutes to ensure he wouldn't be late for what might be the most important meeting of his life. The letter of acceptance he'd sent to Evangeline had been brief, formal, and terrifying in its finality. Now, as he prepared to ride to town to meet a woman whose past remained a mystery and whose future was entirely in his hands. He wondered if loneliness had driven him to make a decision that would change everything, for better or for worse. The stage from Denver rolled into Clearwater Falls precisely at 3 o'clock, its wheels churning up dust that turned the afternoon sunlight into a golden haze around the 6 horses that had carried it across 200 miles of prairie and mountain passes. Lucien stood outside the depot with his hat in his hands, his heart hammering against his ribs as passengers began to emerge from the cramped compartment. A traveling salesman stepped down first, followed by an elderly couple who looked grateful to be on solid ground again. Then a gloved hand appeared in the doorway, and Evangeline Moreau stepped into the Montana sunlight like a vision from another world. She was even more beautiful than her photograph had suggested, with dark hair swept back in an elaborate style that had somehow survived the grueling journey intact. Her traveling dress was deep blue wool with intricate buttons that caught the light, while her posture carried the kind of refined grace that spoke of dancing lessons and finishing schools. But it was her eyes that struck him most forcefully, the same intelligent depth he'd seen in the photograph, but shadowed with something that might have been fear or sadness or simply the exhaustion of a woman who had traveled far from everything familiar. "Mr. Beaumont?" Her voice carried the slightest trace of a French accent, musical and warm despite the uncertainty that flickered across her features. When he nodded, unable to trust his voice, she offered a smile that transformed her face completely. "I am Evangeline Moreau. I hope the journey hasn't been too arduous for such a meeting." Her formal words couldn't quite hide the relief in her expression, as if she had been half expecting him not to appear at all. The stage driver hefted down 2 leather trunks that looked expensive enough to buy half the town, while Lucien fumbled with introductions and arrangements for transport to the ranch. Evangeline's belongings spoke of a life far more luxurious than anything Montana territory could offer, making him wonder again what circumstances had driven such a woman to seek marriage with a stranger in the wilderness. But when their eyes met as he helped her into his wagon, he saw something that gave him hope, a willingness to trust that matched his own desperate desire to believe this could work. The ride to the ranch passed in conversation that felt simultaneously natural and surreal. Evangeline asked intelligent questions about the land, the cattle, the challenges of frontier life, while sharing carefully edited stories about her journey west and her hopes for their arrangement. She spoke of longing for authentic experiences and meaningful connections, but Lucien sensed depths she wasn't ready to reveal, secrets that would emerge only when trust had been established through time and shared experience. As they created a hill and his ranch spread out below them in the valley, her sharp intake of breath told him she found it beautiful, and that beauty might be enough to bridge the gap between the life she'd known and the one she was choosing to build. The house that had seemed adequate during his years of solitude suddenly felt cramped and rough when viewed through Evangeline's eyes, though she moved through the rooms with polite interest and what appeared to be genuine appreciation for his efforts at preparation. She paused at the kitchen window, looking out at the valley where cattle grazed in the golden afternoon light. And for a moment her careful composure slipped to reveal wonder that seemed entirely authentic. "It's magnificent," she said softly, more to herself than to him. "I had no idea the wilderness could be so peaceful." Her examination of the spare room he'd prepared revealed nothing of disappointment, though Lucien couldn't help but notice how out of place her elegant belongings looked against the rough pine furniture and simple cotton curtains. She unpacked with the efficiency of someone accustomed to making temporary spaces feel like home, arranging silver-backed brushes on the washstand and hanging dresses in the small closet with care that suggested they represented more than simple clothing. When she emerged for supper, she had changed into a simpler dress but still looked like visiting royalty in his plain kitchen. The meal he'd prepared, beef stew, fresh bread and coffee strong enough to wake the dead, was received with enthusiasm that seemed more genuine than polite. Evangeline ate with the appetite of someone who had been living on stage food for days, and her compliments about his cooking carried warmth that made conversation easier than he'd dared hope. She asked about his cattle, his plans for expanding the ranch, his thoughts about the coming winter, showing interest in details that many women would have found tedious. But it was during the quiet moments between questions that Lucien sensed the weight she carried. The careful way she chose words that revealed nothing about her past, while suggesting depths of experience that didn't match her apparent youth. When he asked about her family, her answer came a moment too late to be entirely natural. When he mentioned receiving letters from other potential brides, something flickered in her eyes that might have been relief or fear. The mystery of what had brought her west hung between them like smoke from the fire, visible but impossible to grasp. As they sat on the front porch watching the sun paint the mountains purple and gold, Evangeline spoke words that would echo in Lucien's mind long after she'd retired to her room. "I believe, Mr. Beaumont, that we are both people who have traveled far to escape something we'd rather not discuss. Perhaps our partnership can be built on the understanding that some stories are better left in the past, while we focus on writing new ones together." Her hand briefly touched his on the porch rail. A gesture so fleeting he might have imagined it, but warm enough to kindle hope that their arrangement might become something neither of them had dared to imagine when they'd written those first careful letters. The first week of Evangeline's residence established patterns that felt both natural and strange, as if they were actors learning their roles in a play neither had read completely. She rose early, appearing in the kitchen before dawn to prepare coffee with a skill that suggested experience feeding men who worked hard for their living. But her movements carried an elegance that transformed even simple tasks into something graceful, making Lucien feel like he was watching a duchess who had learned to cook out of necessity rather than choice. Their conversations during morning chores revealed layers of complexity that both intrigued and troubled him. Evangeline knew enough about cattle to ask intelligent questions, understood crop rotation principles that most frontier women had never heard of, and demonstrated familiarity with business practices that seemed far beyond what her letters had suggested. When he mentioned the difficulty of getting fair prices from buyers in Denver, she offered insights about market manipulation and shipping costs that made him wonder what kind of education or experience had taught her such things. The mystery deepened when mail arrived from town, including a letter addressed to Mrs. E. Moreau, in handwriting that made Evangeline's face go pale. She claimed it was correspondence from a female friend in New York, but the masculine script and official-looking envelope suggested otherwise. Her explanation came too quickly, with details that seemed rehearsed rather than remembered, and when she thought he wasn't looking, Lucien caught her burning the letter in the kitchen stove with hands that shook slightly. Yet despite the secrets she clearly carried, their partnership was developing in ways that surprised them both. Evangeline proved invaluable help with the ranch's bookkeeping, organizing Lucien's scattered records with efficiency that revealed mathematical skills far beyond what frontier life typically required. Her suggestions for improving their operations showed understanding of large-scale ranching that came from somewhere other than books, while her questions about his plans suggested someone accustomed to thinking in terms of significant financial investments. The evenings were the most challenging and rewarding time, when they sat by the fire discussing everything except the subjects that mattered most. Evangeline read aloud from books she'd brought, novels by authors Lucien had never heard of, poetry that painted pictures with words more vivid than photographs. Her educated voice and refined manner made him acutely aware of his own rough edges, but also stirred memories of the cultured world he'd known before war and grief had driven him west. As October gave way to November and the first snow dusted the mountains, Lucien found himself falling in love not just with the woman Evangeline appeared to be, but with the man he became when he was with her. The second letter arrived on a Tuesday morning when Lucien was in the far pasture checking fence lines, allowing Evangeline to receive it without witnesses to her reaction. When he returned for lunch, he found her pacing the kitchen with the restless energy of a caged animal, her usual composure cracked enough to reveal the fear she'd been hiding beneath layers of refined manners. The letter lay on the table like a coiled snake, opened and read but not destroyed like its predecessor, suggesting contents too important to eliminate entirely. "Is everything all right?" Lucien asked, though the answer was written in the tension of her shoulders and the way her hands trembled as she poured coffee with mechanical precision. Evangeline's smile was too bright, her reassurance too quick, as she claimed the letter contained news of a friend's illness that required prayers but no immediate action. But the postmark clearly showed Chicago rather than New York, and the heavy paper suggested correspondence from a law office or business rather than personal communication between friends. That evening, while Evangeline believed him to be checking the barn, Lucien positioned himself where he could observe the house without being seen. What he witnessed made his blood run cold with implications he didn't want to consider. Evangeline sat at the kitchen table with the letter spread before her, copying information into a small leather journal with the methodical care of someone recording important details. Her movements suggested familiarity with clandestine activity, as if hiding information and maintaining false identities were skills she'd developed through necessity rather than choice. The journal itself, when she briefly left it on the table to tend the fire, contained pages of notes written in a code that mixed English and French in patterns that seemed designed to confuse casual observers. Lucien could make out references to dates, amounts of money that made his ranch's modest profits look like pocket change, and what appeared to be the names of cities across the Western Territories. The implications were staggering. Either Evangeline was involved in something far more complex than a simple search for marriage, or she was running from people with resources enough to track her across half the continent. When she returned to find him standing in the kitchen, the speed with which she closed the journal and the fear that flashed across her face confirmed that his worst suspicions were probably true. "I should have been more honest with you," she said quietly, her refined voice carrying a resignation that suggested she'd been expecting this moment since her arrival. "But I hoped I could leave my past behind entirely, that it wouldn't follow me here." Her dark eyes met his directly, and for the first time since her arrival, he saw the real woman behind the careful facade, someone far more dangerous and desperate than her letters had ever suggested. The confession that followed stretched past midnight, with Evangeline's carefully constructed persona falling away like clothes shed after a hard day's work. Her real name was Evangeline Dubois, daughter of a New Orleans shipping magnate who had built his fortune through partnerships that existed in the gray areas between legitimate business and outright crime. She had grown up in a world where violence wore evening dress and contracts were enforced by men who made problems disappear permanently, where her education in languages and mathematics served purposes far removed from social accomplishment. "My father believed daughters should be assets rather than ornaments," she explained, her voice carrying the weight of someone recounting a life that felt like someone else's story. "I learned to manage his books, to recognize when shipping manifests had been altered, to spot the signs that suggested a business partner might become a liability. I thought I was helping build something legitimate, something that could lift our family into respectability." Her hands wrapped around her coffee cup as if seeking warmth from more than just the liquid, and Lucien could see the guilt that had driven her across a continent in search of redemption. The trouble had started when Evangeline discovered that her father's business partners were using their shipping network to move more than just legitimate cargo, that the wealth that had provided her refined education came from enterprises that destroyed other families while enriching their own. When she threatened to expose the operation, she learned that family loyalty only extended as far as family usefulness, and that her father valued his criminal partnerships more than his daughter's conscience or safety. "They gave me a choice," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper as the fire crackled between them. "Marry Vincent Castellano, a man whose idea of business negotiation involved broken bones and unmarked graves, or have an accident that would solve everyone's problems permanently. Vincent was supposed to be my husband and my keeper, ensuring I stayed quiet about what I knew while providing him with legitimacy and access to my father's connections." The tremor in her voice told Lucien everything about what kind of marriage that would have been, and why a woman of her obvious intelligence would choose frontier uncertainty over urban security. Her escape had been planned with the same careful attention to detail that had made her valuable to her father's organization. False papers, carefully planted trails leading in wrong directions, and a mail-order marriage arrangement that would place her beyond the immediate reach of people who considered killing as routine as bookkeeping. But the letters that had been following her west were evidence that Vincent and her father's organization hadn't given up their search, that they viewed her knowledge as both a threat and an asset too valuable to lose. As dawn light began to filter through the kitchen windows, Evangeline looked at Lucien with eyes that held both hope and despair. "I understand if you want me to leave immediately. I never intended to bring danger to someone who had shown me nothing but kindness. But if you're willing to take the risk, I can offer you something more valuable than just companionship." Her smile was sad but determined, as she opened her leather journal to pages that contained information that could either make them rich or get them killed. "I know where they keep their money, how they move it, and most importantly, how to take it." Lucien spent the following day riding the fence lines, not because they needed checking, but because he needed space to think about a decision that would define the rest of his life. The woman he'd invited into his home as a potential wife had revealed herself to be something far more complex. A criminal's daughter with dangerous knowledge, a fugitive carrying secrets that could buy them a fortune or bury them in unmarked graves. The simple life he'd built in Montana suddenly felt as fragile as spiderwebs in a hurricane. Rex sensed his master's turmoil, staying closer than usual as they moved through pastures where cattle grazed in blissful ignorance of the human dramas playing out around them. The familiar rhythm of ranch work, checking water sources, counting stock, mending broken fence wire, provided physical comfort while his mind wrestled with implications that grew more staggering the longer he considered them. Could he trust a woman who had hidden her identity so completely? Could he live with himself if he sent her away to face alone the dangers that had driven her west? But it was the memory of her eyes during the confession that ultimately decided him. Not the fear or the desperation, but the flicker of hope that had appeared when she spoke of starting over, of building something clean and honest from the ashes of a corrupt past. Lucien understood that hunger for redemption, that desperate need to prove that past mistakes didn't have to define future choices. His own flight to Montana had been driven by similar demons, though his sins were born of war rather than criminal enterprise. When he returned to the house that evening, he found Evangeline sitting on the front porch with her bags packed and a hired horse tied to the rail, her preparations for departure speaking louder than any words could have. Her resignation was complete, her acceptance of rejection so total that it broke something in Lucien's chest to see it. "I understand," she said before he could speak, her voice carrying the hollow tone of someone who had expected abandonment and found her expectations confirmed. "No," Lucien said, sitting beside her on the porch steps where they'd shared so many careful conversations over the past weeks. "You don't understand at all." He took her hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of harder work than her refined appearance suggested, and looked into eyes that had learned not to hope for more than survival. "I've been running from my past just as hard as you've been running from yours. Maybe it's time we stopped running and started fighting." The words felt like stepping off a cliff. But for the first time since the war ended, Lucien felt like he was moving toward something instead of away from it. Her response was a kiss that tasted of tears and gratitude and the kind of desperate passion that comes when people realize they're no longer facing the world alone. As they held each other on the porch while stars emerged overhead, Lucien understood that he was choosing love over safety, partnership over solitude, and a future that might be brief, but would definitely not be boring. The decision felt both terrifying and inevitable, like a man choosing to jump from a burning building without knowing what waited below. The planning began immediately, with Evangeline's knowledge of her father's organization proving as detailed and valuable as she'd promised. Spread across the kitchen table were maps, train schedules, and coded information that revealed a criminal network spanning from New Orleans to San Francisco, with major operations in Denver that handled money transfers for activities that existed far outside legal boundaries. Her father's associates moved fortunes through seemingly legitimate businesses, but their security measures were designed to protect against law enforcement rather than someone with inside knowledge of their methods. They use the Merchants Bank in Denver every month on the 15th, Evangeline explained, her finger tracing routes on a territorial map with the precision of someone who had helped plan such operations from the other side. Vincent personally oversees transfers of what they call special deposits, money that needs to disappear from one place and reappear somewhere else without government attention. They never move less than $50,000 at a time, and security is usually just Vincent and two hired men who think their reputation is protection enough. Lucien found himself thinking like a soldier again, considering sightlines and escape routes with skills he'd hoped never to use outside of war. But Evangeline's plan wasn't about violence. It was about using their own methods against them, taking advantage of their arrogance and predictability to strike where they felt most secure. "They'll never expect someone to hit them in Denver," she continued, her dark eyes bright with the intelligence that had made her valuable to her father's organization. "Everyone knows that's Vincent's territory, that crossing him there would be suicide." The beauty of the plan lay in its simplicity and the inside knowledge that made it possible. Evangeline knew the codes, the schedules, the personnel, and most importantly, the passwords that would allow them to access funds that officially didn't exist. "They keep special accounts under false names," she explained, opening her journal to pages covered with careful notations. "Money that's supposed to be untraceable, held for operations that can't appear on legitimate books. If we take it, they can't report the theft without admitting to criminal activity they'd rather keep hidden." But the true genius of her proposal became clear as she outlined what they would do with the stolen funds. Rather than simply disappearing with the money, they would use it to expose the entire network, providing evidence to federal authorities while ensuring their own safety through strategic distribution of proof that would make killing them counterproductive. "They can't silence us if our deaths would trigger the release of information that would destroy everything they've built," she said with a smile that reminded Lucien that she was definitely her father's daughter, even if she'd chosen to use her inheritance for different purposes. As they finalized details that would either make them rich heroes or dead fools, Lucien realized that somewhere in the process of planning to rob her father's criminal associates, he'd fallen completely in love with Evangeline Dubois, not just with her beauty or her refined manners, but with the brilliant, dangerous woman who could plan a heist while making it sound like a moral crusade. The irony wasn't lost on him that finding love had required embracing the kind of risk that made his war experiences seem peaceful by comparison. They left the ranch on a cold November morning, with snow threatening in the pewter sky and their breath forming clouds that dissipated quickly in the dry air. To any observer, they appeared to be a married couple traveling to Denver on business. Lucien in his best suit, Evangeline dressed with the understated elegance that marked her as someone with money but not the need to display it ostentatiously. Their luggage contained clothes appropriate for their assumed identities, but hidden compartments held weapons and documents that told a very different story about their intentions. The train to Denver was crowded with miners heading to town for winter. Ranchers like themselves attending to business before the worst weather set in, and the usual collection of travelers whose purposes were their own business. Evangeline transformed during the journey, her careful frontier wife persona giving way to something more confident and dangerous that reminded Lucien she'd been raised in a world where deception was a survival skill. She spoke to fellow passengers with the easy charm of someone comfortable moving through society's upper levels, gathering information through seemingly casual conversation. Their hotel in Denver was respectable but not memorable, chosen specifically for its location near the Merchants Bank and its reputation for catering to guests who valued privacy over luxury. Evangeline registered them as Mr. and Mrs. Edward Sinclair, wool merchants from Wyoming Territory, providing papers that looked authentic enough to satisfy a desk clerk who was paid to ask few questions. Their room overlooked the street where Vincent would make his monthly appearance, allowing them to observe without being observed. The reconnaissance that followed revealed that Evangeline's information was accurate but incomplete. Vincent Castellano proved to be a man whose reputation for violence was matched by his paranoia about security, traveling with not 2 but 4 armed men whose alertness suggested they took their jobs seriously. The bank itself was built like a fortress, with guards who carried military-grade weapons and positioning that made casual approach virtually impossible. What had seemed like a straightforward theft was revealing itself to be something that would require timing, courage, and luck in equal measure. But it was during their 3rd day of observation that opportunity presented itself in a form none of their planning had anticipated. A fire broke out in the warehouse district, drawing law enforcement and emergency responders from across the city, including the extra security that typically surrounded the bank during Vincent's visits. As they watched from their hotel window, Evangeline's hand found Lucien's with the electric touch of someone recognizing that fate had just dealt them the card they needed. "Sometimes," she said softly, "the universe decides it's time for justice to wear a mask." Her smile held anticipation and terror in equal measure as they prepared to step across a line that would change them both forever. The Merchants Bank stood like a monument to financial power in the heart of Denver's business district, its stone facade designed to project unshakable stability, while its interior arrangements catered to customers whose transactions required absolute discretion. Evangeline approached the teller's window with the confidence of someone accustomed to moving large sums of money, her forged papers and intimate knowledge of the bank's special procedures opening doors that would have remained closed to ordinary citizens seeking extraordinary access to other people's funds. "I need to access the Dubois special account," she told the senior clerk, in tones that suggested questioning her authority would be both inappropriate and potentially dangerous. The codes she provided were current, her knowledge of security protocols was perfect, and her bearing was that of someone who belonged in this world of shadowy transactions and unrecorded wealth. When the clerk hesitated, she added details about Vincent's schedule and account preferences that could only have come from someone with insider access to information the bank preferred to keep confidential. Meanwhile, Lucien positioned himself across the street with clear sightlines to both the bank's entrance and the routes Vincent's security team would use when they arrived for the scheduled transfer. His role was protection and early warning, but his soldiers' instincts were screaming that something felt wrong about the operation. The fire that had drawn away extra security was burning too conveniently, and the timing of their opportunity seemed almost orchestrated by someone with advanced knowledge of their plans. Inside the bank, Evangeline's confidence began to waver as the clerk returned with news that made her blood run cold. "The account you're requesting has been frozen pending resolution of ownership disputes," he said with the careful neutrality of someone delivering unwelcome news to potentially dangerous people. Mr. Castellano left specific instructions that no transactions were to be processed without his personal authorization. The trap was closing around them with mechanical precision, suggesting that Vincent had been expecting exactly this kind of attempt. The realization that they'd walked into an ambush came too late to prevent, but just early enough to respond. Through the bank's front windows, Evangeline could see Vincent's men taking positions that had nothing to do with protecting a routine transaction and everything to do with capturing specific individuals who had made the mistake of believing they were predators rather than prey. As she met the clerk's eyes and saw satisfaction rather than bureaucratic regret, she understood that her escape from New Orleans had been less successful than she'd believed, and that Vincent's patience had finally been rewarded with exactly the opportunity he'd been waiting for. Vincent Castellano entered the bank with the measured confidence of a man who held all the cards and was about to play a winning hand, his expensive suit and careful grooming unable to disguise the predatory nature that had made him valuable to Evangeline's father's organization. His eyes found hers immediately across the marble expanse of the banking floor, and his smile carried the cold satisfaction of someone who had been anticipating this moment for months. "Miss Dubois," he said with mock formality, "how thoughtful of you to save me the trouble of tracking you to whatever frontier hovel you'd chosen for your rustic adventure." The armed men who followed him into the bank moved with military precision, their positioning designed to control exits and eliminate any possibility of escape through conventional means. But Vincent's greatest miscalculation was assuming that Evangeline had been operating alone, that her mail-order marriage was simply cover for a solo attempt to disappear into frontier anonymity. He clearly had no knowledge of Lucien's existence or capabilities, treating the bank as a contained environment where his superior numbers guaranteed success. From his position across the street, Lucien watched the trap unfold with the clarity that came from years of military experience in situations where split-second decisions determined who lived and who died. Vincent's confidence was justified by his numbers and position, but it also made him predictable in ways that created opportunities for someone willing to embrace chaos as a tactical advantage. The war had taught Lucien that desperation could be more effective than planning when the alternative was capture or death. The distraction began with an explosion in the alley behind the bank. Not the work of accident or coincidence, but a carefully placed charge of dynamite that Lucien had positioned during their reconnaissance, insurance against exactly this kind of situation. The blast shattered windows throughout the business district and sent civilians fleeing in panic, while Vincent's men found their careful positioning disrupted by flying glass and falling debris that transformed their controlled environment into something that resembled a battlefield more than a financial institution. In the confusion that followed, Evangeline demonstrated why her father had valued her intelligence over her compliance, using the chaos to disappear into the bank's rear areas with movements that suggested she'd planned for this contingency, despite hoping it wouldn't be necessary. Her knowledge of the building's layout, gained through careful observation rather than architectural drawings, allowed her to navigate corridors that Vincent's men couldn't follow without risking separation from their leader. As smoke began to fill the banking floor and emergency bells rang throughout the district, the trap that had seemed so perfectly constructed began to collapse into the kind of confusion that favored the hunted over the hunters. The rear exit of the merchant's bank opened onto an alley that had been chosen specifically for its multiple escape routes, but Vincent's forward planning had included positioning men to cover exactly such contingencies. Evangeline emerged from the building's smoke-filled interior to find herself facing two armed guards whose orders clearly didn't include taking prisoners alive. The moments that followed tested every survival skill she'd learned during her months of running, as bullets shattered brick walls where her head had been seconds before. Lucien's arrival in the alley was announced by gunfire that dropped one guard immediately and sent the other diving for cover behind a delivery wagon that provided concealment, but no protection from rounds that punched through wood like paper. His shooting was precise and economical, each shot placed with the kind of accuracy that came from years of practice in situations where missing meant dying. The war had made him an expert in violence, and that expertise was proving valuable in ways he'd hoped never to need again. "This way!" Evangeline shouted over the sound of emergency bells and approaching law enforcement, leading him through a maze of service alleys that connected the business district to the warehouse area where their escape route waited. Her knowledge of Denver's back streets came from the same careful preparation that had allowed her to access the bank's special accounts. Though that information was proving more immediately useful than the financial intelligence that had brought them to the city. Behind them, Vincent's voice could be heard coordinating pursuit with the kind of calm efficiency that suggested he'd managed similar situations before. His men were spreading through the district with systematic thoroughness, cutting off escape routes and establishing a perimeter that would gradually tighten until their quarry had nowhere left to run. But Vincent's urban experience was working against him in an environment where Lucien's military training provided advantages that criminal organization couldn't match. The warehouse where they'd hidden their horses and supplies was already compromised when they arrived, with Vincent's men positioned to command the entrances and eliminate anyone foolish enough to attempt entry. But the building's industrial design included features that civilian pursuers might overlook: loading docks, freight elevators, and roof access that could provide alternative routes for people desperate enough to take risks that sane individuals would avoid. As they crouched in the shadows planning their next move, Evangeline's hand found Lucien's with the electric touch of someone who understood they were about to attempt something that would either save them or kill them, with no middle ground between success and disaster. The warehouse roof provided a commanding view of Denver's business district, where smoke from the bank explosion mixed with winter clouds to create a gray pall that turned afternoon into premature twilight. From their elevated position, Lucien could see Vincent's men moving through the streets with the methodical precision of hunters who had cornered dangerous prey, their coordination speaking to military training that made them far more formidable than typical criminal enforcers. The escape route they'd planned was clearly compromised, leaving them trapped between Vincent's ground forces and a drop that would kill them as effectively as bullets. "There," Evangeline said, pointing to a construction crane that extended from the adjacent building like a steel bridge reaching toward salvation. The span looked impossibly far, the drop beneath it guaranteed death, but the alternative was waiting for Vincent's men to complete their search of the warehouse levels below. Her voice carried the calm calculation of someone who had learned to weigh impossible choices against certain doom, finding courage in situations where fear would be more rational but less useful. The sound of boots on the warehouse stairs announced that their pursuers had reached the building's upper levels, making delay impossible and retreat unthinkable. Lucien went first, his weight and momentum carrying him across the gap between buildings with inches to spare, landing hard on the construction platform with impact that sent vibrations through the entire crane structure. Behind him, Evangeline followed with the grace of someone who had learned to move quickly and quietly, her landing as perfect as if she'd practiced the maneuver for weeks rather than attempting it in desperation. Vincent appeared at the warehouse roof's edge just as they reached the construction building's interior, his face twisted with frustration that had moved beyond professional disappointment into personal rage. "You can run to the ends of the earth!" he shouted across the gap, his voice carrying the promise of pursuit that wouldn't end with geography or time. "But you can't hide from what you know, and you can't escape what you owe." His words followed them into the building like curses, weighted with implications that made their immediate escape feel less like victory than postponement of inevitable reckoning. The construction site provided access to Denver's underground utility tunnels, a maze of passages that connected the city's major buildings while remaining invisible to surface observation. Evangeline's knowledge of the system came from sources she didn't explain, but her confidence in navigating the dark passages suggested experience that went beyond casual familiarity. As they moved through tunnels that echoed with their footsteps and the distant sound of pursuit, Lucien began to understand that his wife's past contained layers of complexity that her confession had only begun to reveal. The utility tunnels beneath Denver stretched for miles in directions that followed no logical pattern, connecting buildings that had been constructed decades apart by designers who had never communicated with each other about unified planning. Evangeline moved through the maze with confidence that came from detailed knowledge rather than lucky guessing, her route choices speaking to preparation that went far beyond what she'd revealed about her escape from New Orleans. When Lucien questioned her familiarity with the passages, her answer carried implications that made the tunnels feel suddenly more dangerous than the pursuit they'd left behind. "My father's organization didn't limit its operations to shipping," she said, as they paused at a junction where multiple passages intersected like spokes of an underground wheel. "Money laundering requires infrastructure that exists outside government oversight. Connections between legitimate businesses and criminal enterprises that can't appear on any official maps. These tunnels have been used to move more than just steam pipes and telegraph wires." Her words echoed in the darkness with revelations that made Lucien realize his wife's knowledge of criminal operations was far more extensive than her earlier confessions had suggested. The sound of pursuit in the tunnels behind them carried a different quality than the street-level chase they'd escaped, suggesting that Vincent's men included individuals with their own knowledge of Denver's underground network. Their footsteps echoed with the confidence of people following familiar routes rather than exploring unknown territory, making it clear that the tunnels wouldn't provide the sanctuary Lucien had hoped. Evangeline's expression confirmed his fears, her face showing recognition that they'd entered a game where their opponents held advantages she'd hoped to avoid. "Vincent knows about the tunnels because I told him," she admitted, as they climbed a service ladder toward what appeared to be basement access to a commercial building. "During the months when I was still trying to work within my father's organization. Before I understood that reform from within was impossible, I shared information that was supposed to help legitimize their operations, make them more efficient and less vulnerable to law enforcement. Instead, I gave them tools that are now being used to hunt us." Her voice carried the weight of someone confronting the consequences of decisions made with good intentions, but insufficient understanding of their implications. The basement they emerged into belonged to a printing shop whose owner had clearly been expecting their arrival, his nervous demeanor and careful questions suggesting arrangements that had been made through channels Evangeline hadn't mentioned. As they waited in the shop's back room while he confirmed that the streets were clear of watchers, Lucien began to understand that his wife's escape from her father's organization had involved more than just geographical distance. She'd built a network of contacts and safe houses that stretched across the Western territories, relationships that suggested planning and resources far beyond what a single woman could have managed alone. The printing shop's owner, introduced only as Samuel, moved with the nervous efficiency of someone who had been providing sanctuary to fugitives long enough to develop procedures, but not long enough to become comfortable with the risks involved. His questions were specific and practical. How many men were pursuing them? What resources those men had access to? How long they would need shelter before moving on. His knowledge of evasion techniques and safe passage routes spoke to experience with federal marshals and private investigators whose motivations were far more dangerous than simple law enforcement. "The railroad leaves for Salt Lake City at midnight," Samuel explained while sorting through documents that would provide new identities for their continued flight. "I can get you aboard without official tickets, but after that you're on your own until you reach the coast. The organization has people in California, but they're not as well connected as Vincent's network here in Colorado." His words carried the weight of someone who understood that survival depended on staying ahead of pursuers whose resources seemed to expand with each passing hour. But it was Samuel's careful questions about the information that revealed the true scope of Evangeline's situation and the reasons Vincent had been so determined to recapture her personally. The documents she carried weren't just evidence of her father's criminal activities. They were operational details that could unravel criminal networks spanning multiple states, involving politicians and business leaders whose legitimate careers depended on keeping their illegal associations hidden from public scrutiny. "Your father's organization was larger than you realized," Samuel said, as he worked on their new papers with the skill of someone who had forged thousands of documents. The shipping business was just one part of a network that included railroad companies, mining operations, territorial governments, and federal contractors whose profits came from activities that existed far outside legal boundaries. What you thought was evidence against one criminal organization is actually intelligence that could destroy dozens of powerful people. His words made clear why Vincent's pursuit had been so relentless, and why their escape would require more than just geographical distance. As they waited for darkness and the opportunity to board the midnight train, Evangeline shared details of her father's true operations that painted a picture of corruption extending from New Orleans to San Francisco, with tentacles reaching into Washington, D.C. itself. The money they'd attempted to steal wasn't just criminal profits. It was funds designated for bribing territorial officials, purchasing political influence, and financing operations that would reshape the Western territories in ways that served private interests rather than public good. Their failed bank robbery had inadvertently positioned them as threats to people with resources that made Vincent's hunting party seem like a minor inconvenience in comparison to what might be coming next. The midnight freight train pulled away from Denver with a sound like the earth itself, groaning under unbearable weight. Its cargo cars loaded with machinery and supplies bound for mining operations that stretched from Colorado to California. Hidden among legitimate freight, Lucien and Evangeline began a journey that felt less like escape than like stepping deeper into a maze where every turn revealed new dangers and unexpected complexities. Their forged papers identified them as mining equipment specialists, a cover that would hopefully explain their presence if questions arose during the 3-day journey to Salt Lake City. The boxcar Samuel had secured for their passage was officially listed as carrying industrial supplies, but its actual contents revealed the true nature of the network they'd become entangled with. Crates marked with innocuous shipping labels contained weapons, ammunition, and documents that spoke to operations spanning multiple territories, while passengers who weren't officially aboard included individuals whose reasons for avoiding attention ranged from political asylum to criminal flight. The train itself was operating as a mobile sanctuary for people whose survival depended on staying invisible to official scrutiny. Among their fellow unofficial passengers was a Chinese man named Liu Chen, who spoke English with the careful precision of someone who had learned the language through necessity rather than education. His presence on the train stemmed from knowledge of railroad construction corruption that paralleled Evangeline's information about shipping networks, suggesting that the criminal organization they were fleeing had tentacles reaching into every major infrastructure project across the Western territories. When he recognized Evangeline's name from wanted notices that had been circulating through underground networks, his expression mixed respect with fear in ways that made clear her father's reputation extended far beyond New Orleans. "They're not just hunting you for what you know," Liu Chen explained as the train crossed into Utah territory through mountain passes that seemed to isolate them from the rest of civilization. "Your information combined with what others have discovered could expose the entire system. The bribes, the contract manipulations, the way they've been stealing federal money designated for territorial development. There are people in Washington who would kill to keep that information from reaching the wrong ears." His words made clear that their flight was part of a larger conflict between corruption and justice that stretched from local criminals to national politics. As dawn broke over the Utah desert, revealing landscape that seemed as foreign as another planet, Evangeline shared the full truth about her escape from New Orleans and the network of resistance that had made her flight possible. The mail-order marriage advertisement hadn't been her idea. It had been suggested by people fighting the same criminal organization from different directions. Part of a plan to position valuable witnesses beyond the reach of elimination while gathering intelligence for eventual legal action. Their marriage had been arranged not just for her protection, but as part of a larger strategy to preserve evidence and protect witnesses whose testimony could bring down powerful people who considered themselves beyond the reach of law. Salt Lake City rose from the desert like a mirage of civilization, its ordered streets and substantial buildings speaking to prosperity built through cooperative effort rather than individual exploitation. But the apparent tranquility was deceptive. Federal agents had been waiting at the train station with photographs and descriptions that suggested Vincent's reach extended far beyond what they'd hoped to escape by crossing territorial boundaries. The network that had provided their sanctuary was clearly compromised by intelligence sources that operated at levels far above local criminal enforcement. Their contact in Salt Lake City was a woman named Rebecca Morrison, who operated a boarding house that catered to travelers whose business couldn't stand close scrutiny, her establishment serving as an unofficial embassy for people whose survival depended on staying invisible to official attention. Her greeting was brief and professional, her questions focused on immediate security rather than social pleasantries, as she led them through back entrances to rooms that had been prepared for rapid departure if circumstances required sudden flight. "The federal agents aren't looking for you specifically," Rebecca explained as they studied maps and transportation schedules that would take them further west toward what they hoped would be sanctuary in California. "They're investigating the entire network, following money trails and document transfers that have led them to suspect that territorial corruption extends far beyond what they initially imagined. Your information isn't just evidence of criminal activity, it's proof that federal development funds have been systematically stolen for private profit." Her words made clear that their flight had positioned them at the center of political investigations that could reshape territorial governance if their evidence reached the right authorities. But it was Rebecca's revelation about Vincent's true employer that changed everything about their understanding of the forces arrayed against them. "Vincent doesn't work for your father's organization," she said with the calm delivery of someone sharing news that would fundamentally alter their strategic thinking. "He works for a consortium of territorial officials and federal contractors who've been using criminal networks to hide their theft of government money. Your father's shipping operation was just one tool they used to move stolen funds and eliminate inconvenient witnesses." The implications were staggering. They weren't just fleeing criminal revenge, but political assassination designed to protect corruption that reached into the highest levels of territorial and federal government. As they prepared for what might be their final flight toward the California coast, Evangeline made a decision that surprised both her companions and herself. Instead of continuing to run, she proposed using their evidence to strike back at the forces pursuing them, turning their knowledge into a weapon that could expose the entire conspiracy while protecting themselves through strategic revelation rather than indefinite flight. "If we keep running, they'll eventually catch us," she said, with the calm logic that had made her valuable to her father's organization. "But if we can get our information to the right people in Washington, they'll be too busy defending themselves to continue hunting us." Her plan was audacious, dangerous, and possibly suicidal, but it offered something that flight could never provide: the possibility of an ending that didn't involve spending the rest of their lives looking over their shoulders. The letter that arrived in Washington, D.C., 3 weeks later, contained enough evidence to trigger congressional investigations that would reshape territorial governance and end the careers of dozens of officials whose corruption had seemed unassailable. Sent through channels that Rebecca's network had carefully established for exactly such purposes, the information reached Senator James Crawford, a man whose reputation for integrity had made him dangerous to people who preferred to operate without government oversight. The documents Evangeline had carried from New Orleans combined with testimony from witnesses like Liu Chen and evidence gathered by underground networks across multiple territories, painted a picture of systematic corruption that reached from local sheriff's offices to federal contract offices. Vincent Castellano was arrested in Denver while attempting to board a train bound for Mexico, his capture triggering a cascade of confessions and plea bargains that unraveled criminal networks spanning from the Gulf Coast to the Pacific Ocean. The organization that had seemed so powerful and untouchable proved vulnerable once federal authorities understood its true scope and began coordinating investigations across territorial boundaries. Evangeline's father, faced with testimony from his own daughter and evidence of betrayal by his criminal partners, chose cooperation over continued defiance, his confessions providing the final pieces of a puzzle that investigators had been working to solve for years. The ranch in Montana had been attacked during their absence, Vincent's men attempting to eliminate any evidence of their connection to the fugitives they'd been hunting. But neighbors alerted by the smoke had driven off the intruders and saved most of the buildings, their actions speaking to community bonds that had formed during Lucien and Evangeline's brief residence in the valley. When federal marshals arrived to provide protection and investigate the attack, they found a community willing to defend people who had earned their respect through honest work and fair dealing. The legal proceedings that followed brought justice, but also challenges that tested their relationship in ways that danger and flight had not. Testifying in federal court required confronting the full scope of Evangeline's knowledge and involvement in her father's organization, revelations that forced Lucien to accept that the woman he'd married carried responsibilities and guilt that couldn't be easily absolved through good intentions or geographic distance. But it was during those difficult months of testimony and legal resolution that their partnership deepened into something stronger than romantic love, a mutual respect built on shared courage and complementary strengths that had been tested under conditions that revealed character more clearly than years of ordinary marriage. 5 years later, they stood on the same porch where their story had begun, watching their children play in the yard while cattle grazed in pastures that stretched toward mountains painted gold by the setting sun. The ranch had prospered through honest work and careful management, their success built on principles that honored both individual achievement and community cooperation. Evangeline's past had been transformed from a source of shame into a foundation for helping other women escape situations where survival required courage that society rarely acknowledged or rewarded. Their love story had begun with deception and desperation, but it had grown into something that demonstrated how two people running from their past could create a future worth staying for. As they held hands in the gathering twilight, surrounded by the life they'd built together, both understood that sometimes the best way to escape the past is to face it directly, with someone you trust standing beside you when the reckoning comes.